You know what's fascinating? There's a specific group of people walking among us right now. And if you pay close attention, they're just different. They fix things instead of replacing them. They don't need constant validation. They're uncomfortable asking for help, but they'll quietly help everyone around them without being asked. They grew up in the 1970s, and honestly, that decade didn't just shape their childhood. It rewired their entire psychology. Let's talk about that. The 1970s was not a comfortable decade. It wasn't curated. There was no algorithm deciding what these kids should watch, think, or feel. There was no participation trophy waiting at the end of a soccer game. You either won or you lost, and then your mom called you in for dinner and life moved on. That sounds harsh, but here's what that created. A generation of people with an unusually high tolerance for discomfort. And in today's world, that's almost a superpower. Think about the childhood these people actually had. You went outside in the morning, and your parents had absolutely no idea where you were until the streetlights came on. No GPS, no phone, no check-ins. Just go. Be a kid. Figure it out. And they did. They scraped their knees, they got into fights, they got lost, they found their way back. Every single day was an unstructured experiment in problem solving. So when life throws problems at them as adults, they don't spiral. They don't post about it. They just handle it. Quietly. Almost robotically. Because that's what they were trained to do since they were 8 years old. Now here's where it gets psychologically interesting. People who grew up in the 70s developed what researchers call an internal locus of control, meaning they genuinely believe that what happens in their life is a result of their own actions, not luck, not the system, not someone else's fault. This came directly from how they were raised. Nobody was over-explaining the world to them. Nobody was protecting them from failure. They failed, they adjusted, they tried again. Repeat. For 18 years. So their brain literally wired itself around the idea that I am responsible for my outcomes. That belief, right there, is one of the strongest psychological predictors of resilience and long-term mental health. But, and this is the part nobody talks about, that same wiring comes with a shadow side. Because when you grow up in an era where nobody checks on you emotionally, where men were told to toughen up and women were told to hold the family together, you don't just become resilient, you also become emotionally sealed. Many people from this generation struggle to say, I'm not okay. Not because they're weak, but because vulnerability was never modeled for them. It was actually punished. Cry too much as a kid in the 70s and you'd hear, stop being so sensitive. So they learned to bury it, deep. And they got very, very good at functioning while carrying weight that nobody else could see. This is why so many adults from this era are incredibly dependable on the outside, but quietly exhausted on the inside. They show up. They always show up. But ask them how they're really doing, and they'll change the subject, crack a joke, or give you a version of, I'm fine, that has been practiced so many times, it sounds almost convincing. There's something else. The 1970s was the last decade before the world became instantly available. There was no internet, no 24-hour news, no social media telling you what your life should look like. So these kids grew up without that constant low-level hum of comparison that defines so much of modern anxiety. They didn't know what other kids had. They didn't know what their life was supposed to be. They just lived it. And psychologically, that created a generation with significantly lower rates of social comparison anxiety. They didn't grow up measuring their worth against a highlight reel, because highlight reels didn't exist. What they had instead was boredom. Real boredom. The kind where you're lying on the grass, staring at the sky for an hour because there is genuinely nothing else to do. And science now tells us that boredom is where creativity lives. It's where your brain reorganizes itself, makes unexpected connections, develops imagination. The kids of the 70s were bored constantly, and they became some of the most creative, inventive, adaptive adults of the modern era. Not despite the boredom, because of it. Now let's talk about something that doesn't get enough attention, their relationship with loyalty. People from this generation tend to commit to jobs, to marriages, to friendships, partly because they were raised in a culture that expected it, but also because they didn't have the option of swiping left on their life. You stayed, you worked it out, you built something slowly over time, and you took pride in that. The psychology of slow commitment, of investment over time, is deeply embedded in people raised in this era. And here's the irony. The very thing that sometimes makes them seem out of touch with today's world is actually one of the most emotionally sophisticated traits a human being can have. They are also, quietly, one of the most adaptable generations alive. They were born into a world with no computers, watched the personal computer revolution, the internet revolution, the smartphone revolution, and they navigated all of it. Not always gracefully, but they navigated it. That kind of psychological flexibility doesn't get celebrated enough. So the next time you meet someone who grew up in the 1970s, who seems a little tough to read, who deflects emotion with humor, who insists on fixing something themselves before calling for help, understand what you're actually looking at. You're looking at someone built in a completely different psychological factory. One without bubble wrap. One where the world didn't always make sense, didn't always feel safe, and nobody promised them it would. And somehow, they're still here, still showing up, still figuring it out. That's not just resilience. That's a masterclass in being human.